Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. My guest today is Mexican activist and filmmaker Leo Herrera. Leo is known for his viral films which tackle issues of queer politics, sex, HIV stigma, and history. His current work is The Fathers Project, a series of short sci-fi films told in the style of a documentary, which imagines a world where AIDS never happened and our queer heroes live. To view the series and find out more about Leo, visit iftheylived.org. Hi, Leo. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I'd like to start out by having you tell me a little bit more about how you first started making film.
I started making films when I was pretty young. It's a very traditional filmmaker story. You know, you get a video camera at 15 and you make films with your family and edit them and show them in school. So it's pretty traditional in that sense.
Mm-hmm. And were there any first projects that really motivated you to think about doing it more professionally?
Actually, when I moved to San Francisco, I started doing small web shorts for parties, for nightlife events that my brother and I would throw, just silly little parties in bars. And they would have projection visuals and we would release little videos on MySpace. And once I did a lot of those, I realized I really liked doing them and I really liked the format of creating films for an audience, you know, at their computer and on the internet. And that kind of started to bring different gigs my way. And when I moved to New York about 8 years ago, before I returned to San Francisco, I started doing it professionally more often and would create films for artists and performers and nightlife events and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Now, The Fathers Project, which you're working on right now, is a series of sci-fi shorts in a documentary style about what would have happened if AIDS never existed. So can you tell us the story about how you came up with that idea for the project?
I started working with HIV fiction a very long time ago when I first moved to San Francisco in my early 20s. And there was always a seed of an idea of what the world would be like if HIV just didn't exist or if we didn't have to worry about it, because I felt that our fear of the disease was this huge driving force in the culture, especially living in San Francisco and seeing it so much firsthand and seeing the results of it. In the Castro at the time when I moved, it had only been less than 10 years since the retrovirals had come out for everybody. And then PrEP happened and the huge discussion around PrEP that was really vicious in our community. And I had already written about imaginary forms of PrEP almost 10 years ago. So since that idea had already kind of happened in its own way, I wanted to imagine the story kind of kept morphing as more developments happened with HIV. And I've always been really interested in the disease and its cultural ramifications. So in the end, I wanted to work on something imagining if there was a cure for it, but something about the whole story wasn't, it was almost more shocking and exciting for me just to imagine it just never happened and that there would be this kind of uninterrupted culture that never had to deal with the hell that it went through during the 80s. And I was very confused when PrEP came out because I was getting a lot of conflicting opinions from a lot of older activists that I was close to and my own community and the information. And there's a lot of suspicion, obviously, with the pharmaceutical corporations. So it just kind of became a therapeutic project for me in the beginning. And then it just started to snowball into this larger idea of creating this whole universe where none of those people died and what they would have contributed. And I've always been very interested in history and queer history. So it was a way for me to kind of become closer to this generation and their work and just experiment as a filmmaker in a format that I'd never done before or that I'd never really seen before. So that's kind of how it came about.
Nice. Yeah, I've noticed that your interest in queer history has shown up in some of your other short films like The Fortune Teller and The Three Eras of Gay Sex. And I could see how that really led into what you're doing now with the Fathers Project. But I'm also curious how you call it the Fathers Project sci-fi series and what your influence in sci-fi is and how you weave that into the Father's Project, what that looks like.
I've always been interested in sci-fi because I think it's one of those mediums where you can really put in you can put up a mirror to your culture and your history in so many ways with it. I watched a documentary that came out, I think, almost 12 years ago that imagined that slavery was never abolished and what America would look like. And the documentary was really interesting. It's called The Confederate States of America. And it starts off with a commercial for an insurance company, and you can insure your house and your home. And then they have this shot of this black man watering a plant, and you're insuring all of your property. And it was a very low budget documentary, but it was really, really fascinating to me. And I really enjoyed that kind of format. And so Fathers is more sci-fi in the way that I'm imagining if this whole generation of artists and activists and scientists and resources weren't spent on the epidemic and, killed the whole generation and all the advancements that we would have had, because I feel like queer people tend to be at the forefront of a lot of technological advancements, especially in communication. I'm proof of that. We pioneered social media in so many ways during the late 90s. It existed for other people, but I think for us, we really used it as a lifeline, especially if you were, 15 or 16 or 17, growing up in a place like Phoenix, Arizona, where there were no gay clubs or there was only a couple of them. But if you were younger, there was no place to communicate other than if you went on gay.com or these AOL chat rooms. And so it always fascinated me how we had sort of pioneered social media in sites like Planet Out. Those were the sites that I would log on to, and, that's where I found my friends. And then it caught on later, and I feel like we've always been really good about that, even if it's like technology with nightlife, STD prevention, those kinds of things. So I think it only made sense that a sci-fi element would be really big for this project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioning those old websites really brings up a lot of memories for me too, because they were very influential for me when I was, just starting to come out. And even though I was living in San Francisco when I was coming out, there were still just ways to connect with people. So I see.
Yeah, and none of my friends were really using those because they didn't need to, because, they were straight and they had school and, they didn't have to be in the closet. But when it becomes a lifeline like that, we learned how to make those really vast. And then, and that kind of led into that MySpace generation. And so it was interesting for me to kind of see that and imagine what would have happened if we had gotten that out so much earlier and what we would have been able to accomplish.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Another thing I've heard you talk about in working on this project is this idea of talking to the ghosts of these men that died. If AIDS didn't happen, they would still be alive or would have lived a lot longer, particularly artists who had an influence on you. And I'm curious what it's been like for you to imagine working with these people or talking to these people now, and how your relationship has changed with these quote unquote ghosts over time while working on this project.
I think that we tend to have these ideas of our heroes as saints. I think that it's important for us to do that because it passes them down, through generations. So it's very easy for us to think about Harvey Milk, for example, who was our first martyr before AIDS, and think of him as this kind of saint. And that's important because it educates another generation. That's how I was literally educated on Harvey Milk, was seeing his suit that he was assassinated in when I came to visit the Historical Society archives in San Francisco, and the exhibit was called Saint Harvey. Then you realize more as you read more about Harvey Milk that he was a very flawed individual because he was a real person, which almost makes him even more exciting and more lovable, at least to me. And you kind of see the context of his assassination and the culture war around it, and the culture war that he was part of, and the ramifications of his own behavior. So I think the more that I study certain fathers or certain figures, the more I get to see their kind of humanity in so many ways, and their frailties and their mistakes, and at least the ones that are documented, and their appetites for sex and all of these things that you're just generally not educated with about heroes. So for me, part of the excitement is being able to discover figures or ideas, and even in their failures, to be able to kind of incorporate them and examine those. So I think that that's what's been And as I've gotten older, because I've been working on this project for a while now, it's been about, I want to say maybe 4 years or close to that. And so now I'm 37, and I was working in this format a little bit, when I turned 30. So I've just I guess I changed what I expect from those figures now. They don't have all the answers that I was kind of looking for, and they probably would have made their own mistakes. But I think what's exciting for me is to imagine them having kind of a clear slate, like not have that panic through the 80s and just imagine them at their best, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in a way, it's therapeutic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how this piece will be very therapeutic for a lot of people, especially the people who lived through the 80s, who were in their 20s and 30s at the time then.
Yeah. And I mean, that's what the reaction from it has been, which is what made the project so nerve-wracking. It's been the most stressful thing I've ever had to do professionally and artistically, because there's a lot of different schools of thought about what would have happened if AIDS never existed, and it usually gets split into two. And one of those is that AIDS really galvanized us and humanized us in the eyes of our oppressors, and, really brought us together when we were being really fragmented in the late 70s as just the overall queer community was becoming very fragmented. And, it taught us organization skills and how to get stuff politically. And the other school of thought is that we were already on the way to do that, and we would have gotten things much sooner. And most people that I talk to are actually split half and half into that. But I think the idea of the film is you want to imagine that utopia because it's therapeutic in its own way. And most of the reactions I've gotten from survivors it makes them very sad, but it also makes them very hopeful. Mm-hmm. And I've gotten that reaction from a lot of people. So that's why I kind of took on that school of thought for it, at least for now. Mm-hmm. I think the episodes may get a little bit darker as I kind of incorporate more of it. But I think the therapeutic part of it, I think, is the most important.
Mm-hmm. Now, one word I just heard you use that I've heard you use and talking about this project before is this idea of a queer utopia. And I'm wondering what your vision for a queer utopia is now.
I think there was so much hope and excitement in the late 70s and the late 60s and through the 70s that you get to really feel that when you do research for stuff like this. So it's not just really like, oh, that was a golden age. It's more of like the level of hopefulness, and also combined with, that specific time technologically based, like how people were able to be anonymous and they could just move into a city. The cities that we have now that are so expensive or cheap then. We were just developing nightlife in the way that we still have it today. Like, at the end of the 60s, people were, like, the DJ was born, gatherings, the idea of communes. So it's just like such a specific moment right after the lessons of the 60s. And then kind of gay people take a lot of those and work them out on their own because they don't have the responsibilities of being straight. And the whole point is that you don't want to be straight, you don't want to be married. So a lot of those values, and they weren't for everybody. Most of those queer utopian values were really only available for middle-class white men. Mm-hmm. But there were a set of ideals for it. And, there was even the gay manifesto. And so my utopia looks a lot like that, but a little bit more grown up. Mm-hmm. And I think if those men and those, trans family and that entire generation hadn't been so disappointed and destroyed emotionally by the epidemic that was filled with horrors, if they had matured those ideals, what could they have educated my generation on? And that's what the utopia really for me is. Mm-hmm. When I kind of express it, is these ideas, if the ideas had been given, the ideas and values of those times had been given the opportunity to mature. Yeah. And to keep some of that optimism, because I feel what AIDS did and continues to do is it kind of confirmed some of our deepest fears of just being gay and this weird punishment, this idea that being gay needs to be punished, which is something that most of us grow up in. And if it hadn't validated that in such a deep, deep way and shown us how little people care about us, the government, how little they cared about us, the religious right. If we hadn't had that validated and we could have kept a lot more of our confidence, what that would have created. is really what the utopia is about. I don't know if I love describing it as that, and I think it's a good catchphrase in a lot of ways. I don't believe that there is such a thing as a utopia. I think there would be issues, but I think they would have been a lot different. And I think they would have been, I think our rates for certain things like addiction, you know, I do believe that meth was reactionary to HIV because I saw it firsthand. And, you know, those kinds of things, our suicide rate, just our problems with religion, all of those things would have been given a little bit of room to, they would have had an entire decade to breathe, you know, and to kind of formulate something at least different than what we have now.
Yeah. Well, what I'm hearing you say about the utopia is more about the wisdom and the strength and the support that we lost as a result of losing those men who, if they survived, they might have been there for those of us who came after them to tell us that we're okay, instead of that being delayed, you know, another 10, 20 years.
Absolutely. And that's, I think it's more about shortening that delay. I think there is a delay. And I think there's a huge generational gap that continues to today. And because I was never taught, like I had to seek out older people really hard to, like, and it was difficult to do that. And I was able to do it because I moved to San Francisco and I showed up at the Historical Society and said, what can I do as like a 22-year-old? And they took me in and they gave me jobs, and I worked in the Castro in a video store where a lot of older men came in and told me stories, you know, so I was able to do that because I actively sought it out. But if you're living in a smaller town or a conservative town or across the border, you know, like if you don't have those opportunities, there's no communication with another generation that would have naturally happened. So you're just going blindly in so many different ways. And then you have this huge boogeyman that continues throughout the entire 90s and the early 2000s. And we're barely seeing an end to that. But again, it's only available for upper middle class white men for the most part. And all of that is so related to HIV. So if you remove that entire thing, I think you'd be left with a much nicer narrative, at least, for what being a gay man is. I think a lot of us are taught really early on that by being gay, you're going to die of AIDS. And that's what we were taught throughout elementary school and throughout the Reagan years. So if the utopia is just, I think, just the opportunity of exploring what that would have been like without this huge burden.
So I want to rewind a little bit and go back to your origins a little bit. So you were born in Mexico and then you moved to Phoenix as a child. Is that correct?
Yes.
And how old were you when you moved?
We left the tiny border town when I was 3. And then we immigrated. Yeah.
So what I'm sort of curious about is being an immigrant yourself and being the child of immigrant parents who came to the United States. I wonder if that having that outsider perspective on the United States, because I'm imagining that the Fathers Project primarily focuses just on the United States. If that having that outsider perspective from both either your own experience or your parents' experience in coming to this country, if that's given you a unique perspective as you look at the United States as a whole as you work on this project.
Absolutely, especially now. When we moved to Phoenix, Arizona, we were undocumented officially. We were on a travel visa, and we were able to naturalize because my grandmother had happened to have been born across the border when she was much younger, even though she lived all her life in Mexico. But it took about 25 years to do that. So we went through the entire gamut of the immigration experience, including all the way to naturalization, which took about 18 years. And in that time, we were very poor, and we had the traditional, if you want to call it that, immigrant. My dad was a day laborer. He worked in construction in Arizona, which was booming at the time, and my mother cleaned houses. And we were able to see all of the immigration policies basically erode, all of the immigration rights erode over the last 20 years. I've been able to see that, especially when Bush gets reelected. Basically, all of the stuff that's happening in the country now was already happening in Arizona 10 years ago. And the policies and the same people that are writing these policies now are the same people and the same faces that I saw growing up. So none of it's very surprising, but it has lent me a level of, strangely, the cynicism I feel for the country allows me to kind of imagine these utopic moments. Right now, I think as an artist, it's really easy to imagine a dystopia. You know, that's kind of the trending thing right now.
Yeah.
And I think that that's therapeutic for other people. But for me, I've already experienced a lot of that stuff. I've already seen it. Like, I've heard of these policies a long time ago. Once they started to criminalize immigration, my cousins were starting to be put in jail and they never came out the same way. My aunts were separated, like, I've seen all of this already. The scope of it is really jaw-dropping, but the intentions behind them are the same.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's really interesting to imagine a place where that isn't the case and where the majority knows how to stand up to that kind of level of oppression, which is why I feel like if we had this generation that's missing, which isn't just about famous artists and activists, but it's about, like the next door neighbor. And a lot of immigration happens through this like secret underground railroad, like it always has. And who knows what would have existed if, the older men that my mom knew, because my mom was a huge fag hag and still is, like if she still could kept a lot of her friends, what that would have been like. So yeah, my view of America is absolutely educated by that, and it's been really difficult, but I think that's part of what makes Fathers exciting for me too, and that's what makes the gay president storyline exciting, especially for the following episodes, is to imagine the complete opposite of what's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
Of having people in power that understand what being oppressed is really like.
Mm-hmm.
It's what they know, and especially if those people in power, had a lot more privilege and opportunity that the rest of us had, which a lot of these men had, which is what allowed them to be able to fight and have the resources to fight so much. So yeah, it's all very related, and it's become more intertwined with kind of my process of being in this America right now, like in this iteration.
Well, yeah, especially with what's happening right now about immigration.
Yeah.
And
so all of that educates that part of it.
Yeah. And I guess rewinding just a tiny bit, I was curious if, when you first started thinking about this project, if your thoughts about it have changed as the political climate has changed. Because if you started working on this 4 or 5 years ago, it was before the current president we have right now and what's going on. And if you've purposely brought in more political stuff than maybe you thought you were going to because of what's happening now.
I definitely have brought a lot more political stuff into it. I think it was also just a natural progression. I worked on a political campaign when I first moved back to San Francisco because I was gone for about 7 years and then I returned. And one of the reasons I came back was to work on a political campaign for a friend as the campaign manager. And he was running for school board here. Mm-hmm. And he kind of follows this like really long, almost dynasty of openly gay politicians. Starts with Harvey Milk and continues with Tom Amiano and all of these people. And this guy was running, and I got a call from another friend that said, can you help with this campaign? Because we kind of need an outsider to lend their own, opinion, certain things. So I came here for that. And so the project has always followed me through these things. And that's when I realized what a political campaign looks like, what it takes to create a poster, for example. And so I sat down and made the Vito Russo poster before our own election and stuff like that. So, but as these policies become public and the administration is really showing what its big plan is, the project has definitely had answers to that, or it's a reaction to it. So in the following episodes, we see Vito Russo establish a kind of a fight against homophobia around the world that is very controversial. And he makes it a point to let the world know where he stands against homophobia. So it's kind of like a weird distorted mirror for what's going on now. And so a lot of those ideas are definitely coming from the news. I'm trying not to let what's going on now kind of ruin their little utopia.
Mm-hmm.
Like the utopic vision that I'm trying to create, because I think that's the whole point of it. That's the break that you're giving people. And I think that it definitely needs to be rooted in real life events. But I think the main purpose of Fathers, as I've been discovering the more I work on it, is that it has a very specific therapeutic use that I still don't fully comprehend, but I know where I have to pull from to work on it. So if I get too stressed out, or if there was a lot of debate within myself whether or not I would involve our current president in it. And, it would have made for probably better press if Vito Russo defeats our current president in a re-election, or, or something crazy happens, like there's an assassination or stuff like that. But then you're starting to pull from this really weird fear place, and then it becomes more it becomes less, and I felt it, like I get very anxious if I'm starting to pull from the wrong places and I'm working on it, because then all of a sudden it becomes just angry project.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to kind of come from a place where I'm excited to work on it and excited to kind of dive into the little world of fathers, which is not linked pretty much at all to our current state. I don't know if that makes any sense, because I know nobody's ever asked me that before, but yeah.
No, it totally makes sense. I mean, what the word that comes to mind for me as you talk about it and as I've watched the first episode is idyllic, right? Everything about it seems very idyllic. And if you bring any of what's happening currently in that is challenging, it sort of shatters that idea where my understanding is it's like, this isn't just about what's happening now. It's about what happened for the last 40 years without the existence of AIDS. So, well, that brings me to one of my last questions, which is, I've heard you talk about this project being an antidote to fear, and sounds like you're already starting to talk a little bit about that, but I wonder if you could share more about how it's an antidote and what the fears are that it's an antidote for.
I think if we keep doing what we're doing now, we'll be able to eradicate AIDS in my lifetime for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Because we already have the tools, we just have to create access to it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, and we're already starting to do it. People that I know, like Peter Staley and my friends from New York, they just had this wonderful article in the New York Times about breaking the patent for Truvada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because it's not available for everybody.
Yeah.
And when I first read it, I was really skeptical about it, because I thought, yeah, right. There's no way. And then a week later, they're going to start working on that in Europe. And I believe they got approved of it. I'm not really sure about what the specifics are, but the point being that everything that happens in fathers has to be grounded in something that we could actually achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And something that has historical precedent. So that's where the antidote for fear comes from. Nothing is too fantastical. Everything is very much possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just about removing this obstacle, 20 years ago and seeing where we would have been. But if we're removing that obstacle now, we still have the opportunity to create all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that you see in fathers has to have a timeless quality to it, and it has to have historical precedent, and it has to be physically possible, so that when you watch it, you think, oh, that could happen. I could turn my ranch into a little commune. I mean, I've seen people do that before for their own, I've lived in San Francisco, or I've been in the Bay Area for so long. Like, I know what a commune looks like. I've done radical fairy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I know that these things are possible when a couple of people get together and just kind of create it. So that's where that antidote to fear comes from, which is this, right now we're being so many ways manipulated by the social media cycle and this information cycle, and, this communal panic attack that we're all having, that most of us aren't really helping each other through. It's just an echo chamber all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the point of me putting out these episodes is just to give people sort of a break from that. And when you kind of give them a break from freaking out for a second, it just gets their gears going about little things that they could be doing to kind of make themselves feel a little calmer
mm-hmm.
and a little bit more inspired, create stuff on their own. And then therefore, you calm that fear down a little bit. And also being gay, you're taught fear so early on, down to the playground, being scared to look like a girl or all that stuff, and then you get to your teens and puberty, and then you're scared into thinking you're going to die of AIDS, and all the mainstream media tells you that so early on, especially for my generation. Or now, you're being taught that the government's coming to get you. And it's a constant state of alertness and anxiety already. And you see that in so many of our statistics of suicide and addiction and anxiety and mental illness and homelessness. And that's like a real thing. So part of what the project Fathers is going to deal a lot with homelessness, and that's why in the first episode where the narrator talks about the colonies, she talks about how the rates of addiction and homelessness and even venereal disease are like the lowest in the country, because to me that was such a powerful idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it makes me feel like we could still achieve that if we create the right tools for one another.
Yeah, well, watching it myself, I definitely feel a break and a breath of fresh air and sort of more ease and hope as I watch it. So I really thank you for creating this for us.
Mm-hmm.
So in closing, can you share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish?
I think my favorite person and experience is my gay brother. I have a gay brother. He's 2 years younger than I am, and we're really, really close. And my mom made sure that we were really, really close because we grew up as immigrant kids and we didn't really go out to play very much. We didn't have many neighbors. You know, when you're growing up as a non-documented immigrant, you end up living a really insular life, especially if you move there alone. A lot of families, you know, a lot of people that immigrate to the United States get to have other families on the other side, but we were the first ones from our family to cross over. So we were alone a lot of the time, but we ended up growing up very, very close and then realizing in our teens that we were both gay and moving together to San Francisco. And we're both very different and we look very different, but we have this exact same sense of humor and this same aesthetic. He's a costume designer. He's really, really artistic. And we both have this really deep appreciation for queer history and for nightlife and for queer sex spaces and all of that stuff. We're very similar that way. And so I think that that's been the most influential thing for me because I was very blessed to have a mirror, which a lot of queer people growing up don't get to have. And somebody to bounce ideas off of and somebody to kind of experience things with similarly so that you have a constant companionship dealing with your queerness. And I think that's given him and I a lot of power with each other and within our community and just even the novelty of hanging out with two gay brothers. I have friends that have queer siblings, but most of them aren't close to them, which I think is a little sad sometimes because it's such a wasted opportunity to me. And I think that's, the most terrifying moment that I have when working on anything is when I finish the first cut of it and then I have to call Alan and we have to have the discussion about what sucks about it. Or whether it sucks completely, because with him and I, it's pure honesty, even if it's brutal. And we both have such a high standard for the other one. So, when I sent him the first episode of Fathers, that was terrifying because I've been working on the first cut for I think nonstop for about 3 months. And then, a few months before that, but I'd been working on it completely alone for 3 months and nobody had seen it. So I sent it out to him as the first person to check it out. And that is usually the most grueling, 10 minutes before I get the call back. And the cut that I sent him was a little bit different than the one we have now, but and it had completely different music. So, it was his idea to, for example, put a more upbeat song. I had it was really ethereal, but it was almost too ghostly because, Fathers is a ghost story in so many ways. And he was the one that was like, you have to leave them with a hopeful note when this episode ends. Like, you need something more upbeat. And so those are the suggestions that make it to the final film that kind of created what it is. And none of my work would be the way that it is if I didn't have him to bounce things off of, or if him and I didn't have kind of a dual experience that you can find yourself in, I guess, is really the way to put it.
Yeah.
I mean, we all feel that way when we discover each other. It was just kind of great to kind of have a head start. And him and I are very big on building community, and we love doing family dinners and we love traveling together and we love herding cats around Provincetown or Burning Man or all of that stuff. We've done so many things together. So I think that's one of the constants in my life that keep me grounded. And obviously the idea that if we did have the epidemic, like how many queer siblings were separated by it. So that's something that's always very present in my mind. Whenever when I can't find the reference point for the grief that this generation felt, I put myself in this position of like, what if I had to watch Alan die a horrible death the way that so many people did? And then that kind of centers me a little bit.
Sounds like you have a really great relationship and you're really lucky to have a sibling like that.
Yeah, I am.
So where can people find more about you and your work and see the Fathers Project?
So you can head to iftheylive.org to see the first episode. We also have a behind-the-scenes documentary that PBS created on it. You can also do tax-deductible donations right on the website. That also benefits the GLBT Historical Society and Museum here in San Francisco. So they get a cut of the proceeds as well, and I get to have a working relationship with them to do more research. And we're going to have a Patreon page, and merchandise is coming up soon as well, because we're fundraising to create the second episode, which will start dealing more with sex and leather, and they're going to get a lot sexier. So I'm excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think following the website is going to be the best idea for people. I don't know how Facebook and social media safe some of the following episodes are going to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And I will have the links to that on the show notes page, so people can also just find that on the website.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, Leo, I'm really excited to see where this project goes. And thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.